Last week, 67 nations gathered together in the South African city of Johannesburg for the 15th annual BRICS Summit. However, this was a summit like no other. The five foundational countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, announced that they were expanding with the integration of 6 new nations into the fold: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, Iran, Ethiopia, and Argentina. Now, as you can see from the map, BRICS literally overnight transformed into the single largest economic and political bloc on the planet. The global GDP purchasing power parity of BRICS 11, as it stands, is now larger than the G7. BRICS controls nearly 40% of the world's GDP, and the bloc now encompasses nearly 50% of the world's population. You heard that right. 1 in 2 people on the planet now belongs to a BRICS nation. Now, of those nations, 3 in particular promise significant geopolitical restructuring: the OPEC nations of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE. Now, we got a foretaste of this back in March of this year when the nations of Iran and Saudi Arabia announced that they had agreed to reestablish diplomatic relations that had been severed for decades. The 2 nations reopened their respective embassies, exchanged ambassadors, and brought to an end decades of proxy wars fought between the 2 nations, most recently in Yemen. And the real shocker, it was an agreement brokered not by the U.S., but by Beijing. And so by bringing in these oil and gas global giants, Tehran, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi, BRICS Plus has, again, literally overnight, become an oil and gas superpower. According to Infotech, BRICS now controls 39% of global oil exports, 46% of proven reserves, and 48% of all oil produced globally. 1 in every 2 barrels of oil produced on the planet comes from BRICS member nations. Russia and Saudi Arabia alone account for a quarter of the world's oil production. Russia and Iran hold the world's first and second largest gas reserves in the world. I mean, this is an economic and commodity dominance that was not even imaginable just months ago. Now, we have to understand just how significant Russia's SMO, their special military operation in Ukraine, was and continues to be for the formation of this alliance. We often talk on this channel about the 3 F's that make the world go around: food, fuel, and finance. Western nations in the G7 hedge their bets on finance. He who controls cash controls the world. Indeed, G7 nations have given up much of their manufacturing and industrial jobs, offshoring them to the global south, like China, for example. China accounts for 30% of the world's manufacturing, by far the largest global share. And this is in part the result of the G7 nations believing that he who controls finance, capital, controls the world. However, Russia hedged its bets on food and fuel. He who controls food and fuel controls the world. And that's because, well, you can't eat currency. He who controls food and fuel doesn't starve and doesn't freeze. Russia's the number 1 grain exporter in the world, the number 1 fertilizer exporter in the world, and second only to Saudi Arabia in terms of oil exports. Russia is a commodities giant that all the economic sanctions in the world couldn't starve. And now they've teamed up with the number 1 manufacturing giant on the planet, China, to produce a commodities superpower, the likes of which the world has never seen. And so these countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they no longer fear Western sanctions. Russia proved that if you're a commodities-based economy like they are, all the cash-based sanctions fall flat. They ultimately prove ineffective. And so commodities-rich nations are now asserting their independence and joining up with BRICS to form a commodities and manufacturing superpower. And here's the astonishing development in all of this. They've cornered the market on food and fuel. Now they're coming for finance. They got the commodities. Now they're coming for the currency. This is huge. But first, gang, if you're a patriot and you're not prepared to defend your home and your family, you need to click on that link below right now before you do anything else and visit our good friends over at Countrywide Concealed and get your concealed carry permit once and for all. Now, if you're like me, You've always wanted to do this, but you've been putting it off, right? You've always wanted to, you've always meant to, but you put it off because of all the ridiculous barriers and requirements and hassle and pain of getting what's ironically our constitutional right. Well, guess what, gang? There's now an amazing solution to all of that hassle, all of that pain. Countrywide Concealed is the quickest and easiest way for you to get your permit. And the coolest thing is that the permit is good in the vast majority of the country. That's right. You won't just have a permit to conceal carry in your own state, but you'll have it to conceal carry in 84% of the whole of the nation. It's as quick and as easy as just watching a video and taking a quiz. And thanks to Countrywide Concealed, boom, your family is that much safer no matter where you go. Getting a concealed carry license has literally never been easier. Click on that link below and join the millions of patriots who've taken back their rights with Countrywide Concealed today. One of the most earth-shattering developments to come out of the BRICS summit is the agreement among all member nations to begin bilateral trading in their own national currencies, bypassing the U.S. dollar. India and the UAE signed a trade agreement back in July that settles transactions in rupees rather than dollars, and yes, that includes oil and gas. Bilateral trade between India and UAE hit nearly $85 billion last year. Now with full BRICS integration, that number promises to only rise. Saudi Arabia is also in negotiations to make a comparable deal with China. The two nations are currently in talks to price some of Saudi Arabia's oil sales in the yuan, the Chinese currency, rather than in dollars or in euros. Now, for his part, Russian President Vladimir Putin called on all member nations to agree on a single settlement currency, most likely backed by gold and other commodities as the primary means of challenging the U.S. dollar. And while the G7 and the dementia-riddled U.S. president all appear rather caught off guard from all of this, one person referred to the G7 nations as basically in a coma as we speak. A number of scholars and pundits are recognizing that the unraveling of the petrodollar is already happening. We have to understand that the petrodollar since the 1970s has maintained the U.S. dollar's role as the premier global currency. What this commodities-enriched BRICS coalition is deliberately doing is they're actively attempting to recalibrate as much of the world as possible, eventually 85% of the world's population, away from the dollar, and the primary way they plan on achieving that is by crushing the petrodollar. Hence why Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE were so important to their membership. Unraveling the petrodollar, along with the establishment of their own banking system, which is called the NDB, the New Development Bank, which of course is going to be the major challenger to the G7-controlled IMF, is key to de-dollarizing the world economy and neutralizing any future attempt by the dolts in D.C. or the bullies in Brussels to threaten any other nation with crushing sanctions like with Russia. We simply cannot overemphasize just how significant this BRICS summit really was and will continue to be in a future that remains very uncertain for the U.S. dollar. Hey, gang, I know what it's like to feel alone out there in these turbulent times, but I broke free. If you too have been looking for a community with like-minded patriots who are serious about resisting globalism, building a parallel economy, and having intelligent and deep fellowship on a regular basis, then you've come to the right place. In my Courageous Patriot Insiders community, we're building a close-knit movement of, by, and for patriots who are breaking free from the outrage and despair cycles of the mainstream media and taking on the fight against globalism. Every week, I deep dive into the content I can't share on big tech and give you the cliff notes on the truth of how patriots just like you are building up their communities, starting patriot businesses, and fighting the woke in both public and private. All with a few history and political lessons from yours truly, of course. If you want to stop feeling alone as a patriot and stand together with this fast-growing community, be sure to click on the link in the description below. Don't wait. Join me and my Patriot Coalition today, and let's get fighting.